So grab your popcorn, a raft of huge announcements from Apple this week, all of which can be seen as a thinly veiled attack on Google and Facebook as the privacy battle we've seen so far this year continues to escalate.
I've got my popcorn out. I'm waiting. What are the big announcements?
If you take the specifics of the technology out of the equation, there's clearly iOS 15 is coming out. We've seen iCloud Plus. There's some very specific announcements, but if you look at that within the context of the privacy battle that's taking place right now, with Apple on one side and Google and Facebook and others on the other side, then it becomes really interesting. And I think the two things that I'm highlighting this week, one is to do with messaging, and the other one is to do with kind of Chrome versus Safari. So let's start on the browser side. Clearly, browsers are your windows onto the internet. Chrome dominates the market. And what we've seen this year is Google start to talk much more about privacy within a Chrome setting. So a privacy first web and a privacy sandbox, all the talk is really good. But what's come out of that initially is the kind of federated learning of cohort, so-called FLOP, which is a way of anonymizing cookies, so your browsing traffic. And it's been slated by the privacy lobby because it enables fingerprinting. Well, Apple has just launched, or has just announced, what it calls Private Relay, which in essence is kind of a quasi-VPN. It's not exactly a VPN. What it does is it breaks the chain between your browser and the websites that you're accessing. So from your gateway to the internet, it blocks that combination of your of where the websites you want to access. And for those websites that you do access, it blocks your IP address. So it kind of breaks that chain. And that's really interesting because the big criticism of what Google's doing now with Chrome is that it opens the door to further fingerprinting, so identifying users as they browse. And what Apple's doing, in its own words, is making fingerprinting as near to impossible as it can. So this has kind of raised the stakes even further in kind of the browser wars.
Although it has to be said that Private Relay does have some problems, it would appear, depending on the country that you're in. Let me just get this list. I was reading this morning a report that Private Relay won't be available if you're in China, Belarus, Colombia, Egypt, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkmenistan, Uganda, or the Philippines. So it certainly isn't the death of the VPN, is it?
No, absolutely not. And if you use a VPN on your iPhone or whatever else, then Private Relay doesn't come into effect. So even if you've enabled it, your VPN will bypass it. So you can still use that in exactly the same way you do. I think it's really critical to say, VPNs do multiple things, right? Some of it is masking your IP address and your traffic, but a lot of it is, in essence, enabling you to bypass restrictions. So it masks your geography. So if you're in one of the countries that you named, people talk about China very specifically, about being able to access internet sites from China by using a VPN. Clearly, that will just continue in the same way. What Private Relay doing is something quite different, which is you access the internet through an ISP, and then clearly you're going out to other people's servers that are providing the internet pages that you're viewing. And what it's doing is it's trying to break that identity chain. So the ISP can't track all of the sites that you're visiting, and the sites that you do visit don't know your IP address. They can't fingerprint your identity and understand where else you might have been and where you go next. That is not the same thing as a VPN, albeit that concept of masking your internet traffic is the same. But critically, and then this is a big deal, and there are echoes of some of what we saw in iOS 14 here. Critically, it will also impact apps on your device when those apps are accessing the public internet. So again, just as we saw with app tracking transparency, there is this onus now on app developers to have to incorporate some of this functionality in how they operate. Some of the ways that potentially apps have been generating revenue which run counter to user privacy are being blocked off.
If you look at this more widely, this is a lot about power and control, isn't it, at the same time? Because a lot of people criticize Google, for example, the amount of control that Google has, the amount of privacy infringing practices, arguably, that it has as well, even with launching FLOC, which it says is supposed to be more secure and private, but it isn't necessarily, is it? So then we're looking at Apple, who is introducing its its own technology. Obviously, it's not the same thing as Flock, and it's not the same kind of impact as Flock, but these two massive tech companies are vying for control in their own way, aren't they? And obviously to have the say and be the one who is kind of more respected for privacy, security, all of these things.
And, you know, as I've said multiple times on here before, you've just got to follow the money. So Google and Facebook, which are the two on the opposite side of the fence from Apple, they're advertising businesses. Both make almost all of their revenue from advertising related services. And therefore, whatever Facebook or Google says in terms of user privacy and security, ultimately that's where it generates its revenue and its return for shareholders.
We're going to see this battle just go on and on, aren't we, between Apple and the other big tech companies, especially the other ones who base their model on advertising, which brings us nicely onto Facebook and iMessage.
There's been a running battle on messaging for all of this year. It's kind of, it came off of the privacy debate, but it runs wide in that. We've seen the WhatsApp privacy backlash. We've seen Facebook criticised by lawmakers around the world for its plans to encrypt Facebook Messenger and Instagram. So that really is a debate that's going to run and run. Now, what we've seen in Apple's product announcements for iOS 15 is talk about iMessage being vastly improved. Now, the really interesting with iMessage is clearly it's iPhone or it's iOS only, Apple only. So it doesn't operate cross-platform in the way that Facebook and Facebook's platforms do, or general SMS messaging or other likes of Signal, Telegram do as well. And so that means there's always going to be a limitation on what iMessage can do. So there was talk about what would Apple do, and we know now that there was talk in the past of would it open its doors to Android. That hasn't happened. What it is doing, which is really interesting, is it's stitching itself further into particularly iOS ecosystem, if you like. So your ability to share photos, memories, share news with friends, you can start to see that, and this was always clearly the plan, the messaging becomes an intrinsic part of the operating system. And that's really interesting because, again, we've got these philosophies at play. Now, we're sitting here having this conversation in Europe, and in Europe, iMessage kind of runs second to the likes of WhatsApp in particular. That isn't the case in the US, and Facebook has been very public about the fact that iMessage is much more dominant in the US than WhatsApp. And now what we're seeing is iMessage, in essence, wanting to increase that stickiness, that domination, if you like. And Facebook is not going to take that well.